Hello and welcome to the Unlocking Behaviour Change podcast, the show all about psychology and changing behaviour. My name is Jamie West. I am a writer, musician and performer, and I am joined by Professor Emeritus of UCL fame, Robert West.
Hi. Did you say Professor?
No, I said of Professor. Did I say Professor?
You might have done.
Well, we'll keep that in because that could be a new moniker for you. How are you?
I'm good. Just got back from a few days in Cluj-Napoca, which is in Romania. Romania. And
that's not me doing an accent. I was copying you rolling your R. No letters.
Romania, which, as the name suggests, although it's in former Eastern Europe, I guess it's still in Eastern Europe, but former Soviet bloc, is not Slavic, but Romanian and more Roman than anything. And they do very, very good wine, lovely restaurants. It's in Transylvania. I think they could make more of the Dracula connection. But then, of course, Dracula wasn't real, so maybe not.
Well, I mean, in Verona, they have Juliet's balcony.
They do. That is crazy.
It's really popular, that, and people love it as well. It's not like it's sort of people look there ironically. I think they're swept up with the story of Romeo and Juliet, and to have any balcony.
This is a Juliet balcony.
So this season we're looking at decision making, and in the recent clutch of episodes we have been talking about forming impressions. So we're really looking at how we take in the world, how our brains process that, how we understand the world. And this, of course, feeds into everything that we experience. And of course, it feeds into the decisions that we make. So this is kind of like groundwork to understand where our decisions are sort of coming from, because we need information to base our decisions on. So how we process that information is obviously vital.
Yes, it is. And it's good to think about the kind of the overarching process. We talked previously about top-down and bottom-up processing. And there's another way of kind of thinking about this that was very nicely set out by a famous psychologist called Piaget. And he was thinking about it in relation to cognitive development, or the development of our mental abilities. And he talked about things called schemas. Strictly speaking, I suppose one maybe should call them schemata, but that sounds a bit kind of up oneself to call them schemata. So let's call them schemas. And the processes of what he called assimilation and accommodation. And the basic idea is a relatively straightforward one that I would imagine would resonate with people, whether or not you're a psychologist, which is a schema is a kind of mental framework that you have at a particular time that has developed over time and through experience and through thinking and so on. And it colors the way that you view the world. It's the categories that you use to think about the world. It's the kinds of attributes you pay attention to and so on. And it's not just your beliefs. It really is about your mental framework. And the ideas then of these two processes, which Piaget talks about in terms of cognitive development, of accommodation and assimilation, are the idea that when you encounter a new experience or perception, your first approach to it is to assimilate that into an existing mental schema. So the way that you already think about it. So when you see someone, let's say, smoking a cigarette, for example, to use an example that I commonly use for can't think why, but you see someone smoking a cigarette, that then triggers a whole range of sort of conceptual images and thoughts and categories and so on about that person and what they're doing, and you assimilate it. So you might think automatically, well, that person's addicted. you might think automatically that the person has certain personality characteristics or social characteristics. And so you're essentially not necessarily learning anything new about that person. All you're doing is assimilating that experience into your existing mental schema. But then, let's say the person does something unexpected, or you get some unexpected experience, then which doesn't fit your schema. So let's say you were expecting the person to be, I don't know, working class or something like that, and then they start speaking with a very posh accent or whatever. Then you go, oh, right. Your brain is thinking, okay, I've now got to accommodate the schema to that new experience. And what Piaget pointed out, and I don't think anyone denies, the fundamental truth of what he was saying, was that the whole process of learning, cognitive learning, and impression formation and belief formation and so on, is this constant cycle of assimilation and accommodation.
So as we're talking about this, I'm thinking that, of course, we must learn our basic schemas when we're young babies and children. Primarily, we'll be learning, we know so little. We need to be taught about what is a house, what is a person even. But when we're adults, we still have to learn new things. But I've noticed that when adults have to learn new schemas, new things come along, we're quite resistant often at first to new things, whereas children will accept it. And the example that came to my mind was influencers. So I'm old enough to have not lived in an age where there were influencers, right? As they're known now, it's sort of YouTube influencers or something like that. And so when that comes along, I'm feeling like, oh, whoa, what the hell is this? And I almost, and other people I know kind of almost deny it as a thing. You kind of want to push it away. You're like, what? They advertise products on TikTok, and then people, what is this? It's quite baffling if you didn't grow up with it. But for people who grew up with it, they're like, oh, I want to be an influencer. That looks, get money and status, and maybe you can help people as well. It's not an entirely negative as I've sort of first experienced it, potentially. So I was kind of interested in this idea of when we learn schemas and how receptive we are to them.
So you're bringing up two things there in that example, which I think are both important. One is, as you say, that our flexibility in terms of accommodating to new information so that we revise our schemas in response to new experiences, which does have quite a strong sort of personality dimension to it. In the Big Five model of behavior, openness to experience is one of the big dimensions on which we differ, and that is true across all cultures. So,
and just to say for listeners who, a lot of them will know what the Big Five are, but they are personality traits that have been sort of proposed and studied, and there's 5 of them. They're called the Big Five. Let's see if I can remember what they are.
But before you say what they are, they're not traits, they're dimensions. They're dimensions.
They're a dimension.
Yeah.
What's the difference between a dimension and a trait?
Okay. All right, let's do it now. So a personality trait might be something which is a characteristic that you say a person's got, like generosity, right? This person is generous. You can think of that as a trait. Generosity as a dimension could go from very ungenerous to very generous. So in the Big Five, you've got they're actually dimensions that can go from one extreme, as it were, to another extreme.
I see. Okay. So a trait, in the way that you're defining it, is kind of like you would just say someone is generous, and it wouldn't necessarily have a sort of percentage of how generous they are, if using that idea of a trait. And a dimension more naturally lends itself to going, this person is very open or they're very closed.
Exactly.
Everything in between. So what are they? They're openness, They are extroversion and introversion.
Correct.
Which people are quite aware of because people usually define themselves as extroverts or introverts.
Yeah.
What are you, extrovert or introvert?
I'm in the middle. I don't know. I think I'm introverted. What do you think?
Extrovert. Oh my God, no, I can't remember. I know that there's the other ones. Remind me what they are, otherwise we'll be here all day.
Conscientiousness and
That's right.
non-conscientiousness. That's 3. Then you've got the term that's used in the Big Five is agreeableness, to put it positively, and disagreeableness is obviously the other side. And the other one is anxiety, trait anxiety. So, people are more or less have a greater or lower tendency to anxiety. They've got a greater or lesser tendency to be horrible or nice, and empathic and good to other people. More or less tendency to be extrovert or introvert, which means sociable and stimulus seeking, or the opposite. And then you've got openness and conscientiousness. So, and what's interesting about these Big Five is that they really have stood the test of time. It's not, no one's saying this is everything you ever need to know about someone, but they get you a fair degree of the way to know what, if you think about these as dimensions and think about a score on each of these dimensions, that would give you a sort of profile that would then be potentially of interest in predicting behaviors to a certain degree.
There's other ones that people do in offices, things like Myers-Briggs, which I think can get a little bit confused with this, but they are separate things. The Myers-Briggs, I believe, is based on some of Carl Jung's ideas and then taken forward. And I think the Big Five, and then you end up with a sort of I can't remember what it is, a letter system. I can't remember.
Yeah, and there's more, in the Myers-Briggs, it's mainly for occupational psychology. So in a particular domain like occupation, or you could, let's say you were doing a personality test for someone joining the civil service, which is what I did. There'd be other ones which drill down in more finer detail into some of these dimensions, but also include other kinds of dimensions of individual difference that are potentially relevant for that scenario. So the Big Five is really very, very general, and and anything that's that general is going to have relatively little predictive power in any given situation. But it won't be nothing. But what was interesting, probably most interesting about the research that was done on it, is it seemed to be cross-cultural. So it seemed to be something that applied to humans. Rather than a lot of them, which are very localized in what kind of tendencies do you have as a European or as an Australian or whatever.
That's interesting that it could be more universally applicable. And of course, I'm immediately thinking of friends who are Italian who I know who are more expansive, so may seem more extroverted. But yet, of course, I guess they'll have studied it and kind of found it might be that whole culture has a slight tendency in some directions just because that's the norm. But that would be fascinating to learn a bit more about that. But and so how does this relate then? We sort of done a sidebar on the Big Five, and we're looking at schemas.
Yeah. And so what you were talking about was the extent to which your openness changes over time as you mature, and there'll be and what I was just saying is that there's also an individual difference there, and actually cultural difference as well. So, what underpins that is that, and I hope we've got time to come on to it in this episode with wine, is that the more elaborated your schema of something as a result of your experience with it, then the more you will be engaging in assimilation rather than accommodation. So the more hooks you've got to hang new experiences on, rather than having to invent new hooks or change the way that you organize those hooks. And so there's a natural process there. But there's also, in addition to that, as you get older and mature, and then get into old age, there is a natural process of increasing mental rigidity. So those two processes together will play a role in what you're talking about, and it makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. When you're a child, you've got to learn a whole lot of stuff as quickly as you can, and then you've got a model of the world which you can function with, and it may be better or worse, but you can't keep going around changing it all the time. Otherwise, things are going to get very confusing. But the other side of it that I wanted to just bring up, that you kind of alluded to with your example, was about cross-cultural differences and the fact that cultural changes occur. So, as the concept of influencer comes into a culture, that then creates schemas for the individuals, and everyone's will have their own somewhat slight, possibly different view about what a scheme, an influence is. Like when I first heard about it, I thought, like you, I thought, that's a thing? And of course, now that I've been exposed to all this talk about influencers and what they do, I've got a more elaborated schema of it, and I go, well, I have my own value judgments about it. We talked about forming value judgments very quickly, and I form mine extremely quickly. I have my own value judgments. I think it's a terrible thing. It's very detrimental to society to have this concept of someone whose job it is to influence. Crying out loud. Anyway, it is what it is. But it now the term influencer means more than the term influencer did to anyone, back in the day.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite interested in this idea of mental rigidity as we age, especially because the age that we live in has, in my lifetime, I'm 39, so a lot has changed. I remember, pretty much, not exactly the very start of the internet, but close to, I remember when the internet became a normal thing that everyone had. We had it a bit earlier than others because you are an early adopter of some of this kind of stuff. So in the 90s, I remember this, using the internet and all these early things. And now, of course, so much has changed. So our mental rigidity has really been under, what's the phrase? Under the cosh, because under stress, because my God, you've got to try and keep up. And the social ramifications of some of not keeping up is quite difficult because, you might just be using an app on your phone that you need to use for banking, whereas someone who doesn't really understand what an app is going to be in trouble. Something that, now I'm saying that's quite basic, but, if I was 80, it might not be.
No, that's right. And of course, now with generative AI and these language models, things are taking off in even faster and developing in, very interesting and in some cases somewhat crazy ways because, I mentioned earlier that one of the functions of increasing mental rigidity is so that you don't keep getting confused all the time by changing your schema. You need stability in your schemas. You need to have a sense of what the world is supposed to be like. But as the world changes very quickly, and you've got to adapt to that, that then throws, to use a sort of metaphor, throws the pack of cards up in the air, and then they may land in all sorts of crazy places. And I think I don't know, this is a pure hypothesis, but I think we're sort of seeing that in the kinds of ways in which, and this is certainly without any value judgments, or I'm not intending it to involve any value judgments, the ways in which lots of social constructs that have been fairly stable for a pretty long period of time are very rapidly evolving and developing, pretty basic ones, historically, we are increasingly throwing our cards up in the air and seeing where they land. Now, who knows where that will end? I find it hard to believe that it can carry on at this pace because it's going, the changes are so quick. But you can also see how for some people, particularly personality characteristics who are, people who are less open, this would be quite threatening for them. And that confusion, which some people might embrace as something to be, as a sort of growth experience, that people who are less open and older typically will go, oh my God, I can't take any more of this. What's going on? And feel quite negative about it.
I mean, I would say generally the general discourse on generative AI publicly amongst people just, in conversations is relatively negative. I would say amongst companies who they want to be using AI because they want to be cutting edge. So there's a real mismatch between how the anxiety that people are feeling about the pace at which this stuff is developing, and companies who want to be driving it forward so that they can be at the forefront of their industries.
And interestingly, this is something you see with technology generally. You have people, and there are genuine threats. It's not all kind of fear of the unknown and worry about your mental models and your view of the world being challenged. Whenever you bring in a new technology, there's always huge opportunities and huge threats. And the way that society decides it's going to handle these new technologies plays a critical role in the extent to which they end up being very positive or negative, or the balance, the blend of positive and negative. And you're absolutely right that with generative AI as a technology and as a tool for industry and academia and the professions, offers enormous opportunities that I think probably the general public wouldn't really see because they're not quite sure what the generative AI is. It looks like something that behaves as though it's intelligent. It's not. To give a very, very quick overview of what these language models do is that they take enormous amounts of information, which we call context, from the internet, from stuff that you feed it, from manuals and so on. They are capable of learning associations between these things in a very clever way, which means that they can do a particular very simple job incredibly well in a way that makes them look intelligent. And that simple job is to predict the next token. And the next token could be, think of it like a word. It's like so when you put a prompt in, like a question, all it's doing is saying, right, what's the first word of what the most likely answer is? Then what's the second word of the most likely answer? And what's the third word? And it does this in a way that takes into account such enormous amounts of information that it looks incredibly human. It doesn't make language mistakes, even though none of us really understand the full grammar of any of our languages. It doesn't make mistakes. It speaks in good language, and it can code computers, and it can produce reasonable sounding bits of music and so on. But what people need to know, if they don't already know this, is all literally, I'm not kidding, all it's ever doing is predicting the next token. So it's not intelligent in that sense. It doesn't understand anything, but it certainly looks as though it does.
And I was looking into this and I was trying to find out why on something like ChatGPT, it was often giving actually good advice that as opposed to bad advice. Something is maybe a subject that you know about, that I know about, and you go, actually, this is very sensible advice. And I think it was, I asked ChatGPT why this was, so it maybe just made this up because they do hallucinate quite a bit. But it said that they prioritize information from so-called trusted sources. when they're doing
Yeah.
it. So there's a lot on the internet, but they're not going to, sometimes they'll be prioritizing a Reddit thing. If it doesn't really matter, they'll say someone on Reddit said this, but it's not going to say that is what should you do with this medical problem. It's not going to, someone on Reddit says, I don't know if they're right.
Yeah, that's true. It goes to, I mean, we're sort of a bit short of time on it, but maybe we can cover it a bit more depth later because people are interested in it. It goes to another feature of the way these language models are trained, which is they're first of all, they're trained using a form of what they call supervised learning, which is basically testing them on how good they are at predicting the next token. But then, crucially, you take the model that that's output from that process, and you use what's known as reinforcement learning to tune that model so that it's doing stuff that users want it to do. So if users want good information, accurate information from the model, you want to train the model and tell it, was that a good answer or a bad answer? And a huge amount of that goes on. And that then helps to shape the way that the model responds. And that reinforcement learning can be done on any parameter: accuracy, how much people enjoyed it, how interesting they thought it was, how angry it made them. Literally with reinforcement learning, which we can talk about again another time because it's just like human or animal reinforcement learning. Well, it's quite like it. Reinforcement learning is you're saying, did it do well or did it do badly on whatever criteria you decide to select.
Right. And we are going to bring this back to schemas. But for this part of this episode, we are going to leave it there. And we did say we would talk about wine, and we will in the next part. I myself went to a wine tasting, shock, because I barely drink, but it was fun. And we will be talking about that and much more in the next episode. So it just remains for me to say, Robert, thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure as always, Jamie.
And thank you for listening. And do have a look at the links below in the episode description for books and links to social media stuff. Dad is an influencer, I think. You can check out his Substack and be influenced by that.
Actually, before we end, funnily enough, I even, when I do consultancy for pharmaceutical industry, the term that they used is a KOL. Key Opinion Leader.
Oh, Key Opinion Leader.
Which I always found hilarious because I don't think anyone took any notice of my opinions ever.
Before. Okay, you're a Key Opinion Leader. That's like a super influencer, I'm going to call it. All right, well, thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to joining you next time on the Unlocking Behavior Change podcast.